Welcome back, econ junkies and financial freedom fighters, to Boss Economics World, the only place where we slice through the government's economic fairy tales and serve you the raw, unfiltered truth. I'm your host, the boss of busting bad policy, and today, oh boy, do we have a juicy one for you. The European Central Bank, ECB, just slashed interest rates for the 7th time since June 2024, dropping the deposit rate to 2.25%. But hold your applause, folks, because this isn't a victory lap, it's a desperate CPR attempt on a Eurozone economy that's flatlining faster than a politician's promises after Election Day. And guess who's to blame? Spoiler alert, it's not just the ECB, it's the clowns in government suits who've been asleep at the wheel while global trade tensions light the fuse on a full-blown economic dumpster fire. Let's dive into the mess, shall we? The ECB's latest rate cut is like putting a band-aid on a bullet wound. It might stop the bleeding for a hot minute, but it sure as heck won't fix the underlying carnage. And what's causing this carnage, you ask? Oh, just a little thing called global trade tensions, a polite way of saying the world's economic superpowers are engaged in a game of tariff chicken, and Europe stuck in the middle, getting run over by both sides. But before we get into the nitty-gritty, let's zoom out and look at the big picture, because this isn't just about interest rates, folks, it's about a systemic failure of government policy that's dragging the Eurozone into a recessionary abyss. First, let's talk about what's happening on the surface. The ECB, led by President Christine Lagarde, just lowered its deposit rate by a quarter point to 2.25%. Now, for you finance nerds out there, this was no surprise. Bloomberg's analyst poll had this move pegged like a bullseye. But here's where it gets spicy. The ECB dropped the word restrictive from its monetary policy statement, signaling they're ready to keep slashing rates like a Black Friday sale on borrowing costs. Markets are now betting on 3 more rate cuts before the end of 2025, with some heavy hitters like Goldman Sachs and Deutsche Bank forecasting even deeper reductions, potentially down to a terminal rate of 1.5%. Why the sudden panic, you ask? Well, Lagarde herself admitted it, downside risks to economic growth have increased. Translation: the Eurozone's recovery is teetering on the edge of a cliff, and global trade tensions are the gust of wind threatening to push it over. The US, under President Donald Trump's latest tariff tantrum, has slapped a 10% tariff on European Union products for 90 days, with no clarity on what happens next. Meanwhile, Trump's standoff with China has spiraled into a full-blown economic cage match, raising the risk that cheap Chinese goods get dumped into Europe, undercutting local industries. It's a double whammy of export dampening and investment crushing, and the ECB's response: slash rates and pray. Classic. Now, let's dig deeper, because the ECB's rate cuts are just the tip of the iceberg. The real story here isn't monetary policy, it's the colossal failure of governments, both in Europe and beyond, to manage the global economy responsibly. Let's start with the US. Trump's tariff spree isn't just a negotiating tactic, it's a sledgehammer to the fragile scaffolding of global trade. According to the Peterson Institute for International Economics, U.S. tariffs on imports have already cost American consumers and businesses $135 billion since 2018, and the latest round of tariffs could shave off 0.2% of global GDP by 2026. But here's the kicker: Europe, with its export-heavy economy, is disproportionately vulnerable. The Eurozone relies on exports for 20% of its GDP, and Germany, the bloc's economic powerhouse, ships out 40% of its goods to foreign markets. When tariffs hit, Europe bleeds, and governments have done squat to prepare. And what about Europe's own leaders? Oh, they've been busy patting themselves on the back for green transitions and digital innovation, while ignoring the elephant in the room: their economies are woefully unprepared for a trade war. Take Germany, for example. Its industrial sector, the backbone of its economy, is already reeling from high energy costs, up 30% since the Russia-Ukraine conflict disrupted gas supplies in 2022, and now it's facing a tariff wall from the US. The German Ifo Business Confidence Index, a key indicator of economic sentiment, just plunged to its lowest level since 2020 in March 2025, signaling a potential recession. And what's the German government's response? Throwing money at infrastructure and military spending, as if new highways and tanks will magically offset the loss of export markets. Brilliant. Now, let's back this up with some hard data, because here at Boss Economics World, we don't just rant, we bring the receipts. The Eurozone's economic indicators are flashing red like a fire alarm in a match factory. First, inflation. The ECB's holy grail of 2% inflation is within sight, with March 2025 data showing consumer prices up just 2.2% year-over-year, down from 2.4% the previous month. Sounds great, right? Wrong. This isn't a sign of economic health, it's a symptom of collapsing demand. Falling energy prices, a stronger euro, up 6% against the dollar in the past year, and weaker export markets are all dragging inflation down, raising the specter of deflation. Remember Japan's lost decade? Yeah, Europe's flirting with a sequel. Next, let's talk growth, or the lack thereof. Eurozone GDP growth was a measly 0.6% in 2024, and the ECB's own projections for 2025 have been slashed to 0.8%, down from 1.2% just 6 months ago. Meanwhile, unemployment, which had been trending down, is starting to tick up again, with the Eurozone rate hitting 6.8% in February 2025, up from 6.5% a year earlier. And don't even get me started on consumer confidence. The European Commission's consumer confidence indicator just hit its lowest level since the post-COVID recovery, dropping to -15 in March 2025. People aren't spending, businesses aren't investing, and governments are too busy bickering over climate goals to notice the economic tsunami on the horizon. Now, let's have a little fun, shall we? Christine Lagarde, in her infinite wisdom, told reporters that the ECB needs to be data-dependent and rely on safe, reliable data. Oh, bless her heart. Here's a hot tip, Christine, the data's been screaming recession for months, but you and your government cronies have been too busy chasing neutral rates and patting yourselves on the back for disinflation to notice. And speaking of neutral rates, Lagarde had the audacity to call the concept meaningless in the current climate. Well, duh. When your economy's on fire, arguing over whether monetary policy is neutral is like rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. But hey, at least she's agile, right? Agility in the face of a trade war is like bringing a squirt gun to a forest fire, cute, but utterly useless. Here's the bottom line, folks, the ECB's rate cuts are a sideshow. The real villains here are the governments, both in Europe and the US, who've spent years kicking the can down the road instead of building resilient economies. The US government, with its tariff obsession, is playing Russian roulette with global trade, and Europe's leaders are too busy navel-gazing to fight back. Where's the coordinated trade strategy to counter US protectionism? Where's the investment in domestic industries to reduce reliance on exports? Nowhere, that's where. Instead, we get half-baked military spending and infrastructure boondoggles that do nothing to address the root causes of economic fragility. And let's not forget the Federal Reserve, which is stuck in its own mess across the pond. Fed Chair Jerome Powell warned that a weakening economy and elevated inflation could bring the Fed's dual mandate into conflict. Gee, you think? Maybe if the US government hadn't spent the last decade pumping cheap money into the economy while ignoring structural issues like wage stagnation and supply chain vulnerabilities, we wouldn't be in this mess. But hey, why fix problems when you can just blame China, right? So, what's the takeaway, econ warriors? First, don't be fooled by the ECB's rate cuts, they're a desperate attempt to paper over a gaping economic wound, not a solution. Second, hold your governments accountable. The real reason we're staring down the barrel of a recession isn't trade tensions or inflation, it's the systemic failure of policymakers to prioritize long-term economic stability over short-term political wins. And third, get loud. Share this video, hit the streets, and demand better from the suits in Brussels, Washington, and beyond. Because if we don't, the only thing we'll be recovering from is the rubble of their incompetence. That's all for today, folks. If you like this dose of economic truth, smash that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell, because here at Boss Economics World, we're not just watching the economy crash, we're calling out the clowns who lit the fuse. Until next time, stay sharp, stay skeptical, and remember, the only boss you should trust is the one busting bad policy. Peace out.